Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I hope you all enjoyed your lunches. Today, we're going to be talking about using diversity as a tool to engender collaboration between HI and AI to tackle cognitive biases. Can you all hear me okay? Great. I know it's a mouthful, but let me simplify it. I will be looking at why collaboration between HI, or human intelligence, and AI is important, what cognitive biases are, and why we should look at some non-traditional means of recruiting a diverse group of data professionals. Firstly, what are cognitive biases? Cognitive biases are systematic patterns of deviance from rationality in judgment, decision-making processes in which people construct their own reality based on cognitive limitations, motivational factors, and/or adaptations to natural environments. But what does that really mean? Well, it means that we as people, in an energy and time-saving effort, will tend to validate any information or data that will verify our subjective perceptions of the situation and reject any information that does not support our subjective perceptions. Now, this can be a time-saving tool. It can even be convenient, but that doesn't mean that this is necessarily the correct way to be able to assess the data. And as we are the coders of AI, we're often hard coding our own cognitive biases into the code itself. So it's not AI mimicking our behavior, we're actually creating it ourselves. Now, this is a well-documented and studied phenomena in the field of psychology. We are aware when you study psychology that as a therapist, you have cognitive biases. And it's so important to the therapeutic process that you be able to mitigate this, to be able to truly listen to your clients. Now, when we're looking at AI, we pretty much have to take the same approach because the same exact thing is happening. The coders are taking shortcuts that support their perceptive reality or their code in order to create outputs that agree with that subjective reality. Now, this can be all good and well for taking shortcuts and making sure you're getting the code out faster, but what does that really look like? It means, for instance, if I'm coding an AI program that needs to identify desserts, and I use maybe my 10 favorite desserts, 6 of which have strawberries in it, it means that the code is going to, more often than not, identify desserts that have strawberries in it as desserts. And ones that maybe have chocolate in it, it'll reject it as not a dessert. Now, I know this is a very simplistic example, but what if you replace the word desserts with university, or spending habits, or customer profile? As you can see, this can become very problematic over time. You can either get code that, while inherently is doing the job it's told, it's not really doing the job that you want it to do. And these can create all kinds of issues, PR. I'm sure I don't need to tell anyone in this room how AI has failed at times because of cognitive biases. The other issue, of course, is that it comes up with nonsensical data, or it's just repackaging the exact same information that already exists. Now, similarly to Gen AI, we can have context, either if it's images or text itself. That is absolute nonsense. I'm sure we've all seen or used ChatGPT or any number of tools where we're like, what? That wasn't what I was asking at all. And how do we solve this problem? Well, ultimately, because the code is being reflected the cognitive biases of the coder, surely the problem and the solution is the coder themselves. Now, the way that psychology deals with this, because right now we don't have a wealth of information to generate from AI or anything within LLMs, we have to look at what already exists. And so what psychology suggests is that we look at our own biases through introspection. And I know this is a very simplistic way of looking at it. But sometimes simplest is best. Because, for example, you could look at someone separating the chain of command in the code. Either the person that's generating the code isn't the one that's checking the code, or you could have someone that doesn't come from a CS background at all. Now, why would we do that? Well, in psychology, we call this a double-blind study. And we do this to eliminate any kind of biases that the person that's actually doing the testing can have on the outcome of the information. It's basically fact-checking. So what do I think we should do? Or what should we do? We can be trying to hire more diverse candidates, more diverse students, and more diverse professionals. Now, I know most of you are like, yeah, come on, that's pretty obvious. But it's more complex than the standard diversity tools that we're already looking at. Things like gender identity, sexual orientation, and of course, ethnicity and nationality. Now, why do I say that? Well, if we look at the study behind you, I looked at a report that's already been conducted of how many professionals in IT self-identify as introverts. And as you can see, it significantly outpaces any other professionals combined. There are 3 times more introverts in IT. Now, why is this important? Because if we have the same personality traits, we're going to be thinking the same way. But you don't have to believe me. Let's check this out about everyone in the room. How many people here identify with at least one of these personality traits, just by show of hands? Almost everyone. Fantastic. All right. How many people have 3 of these personality traits? Just by show of hands. Still a lot of us. All right. Great stuff. What about 5 of these personality traits? Okay, good. So many of us still. Anyone got all of them? Great. All right. So what we're seeing is, even though right here in this room, we're all of different sexual identities, nationalities, and ethnicities, we're all still very similar. So why should we hire people that think differently? Well, I'm sure this will come as no surprise to anyone, but ultimately, diversity is a driver for innovation. Now, what can that look like, for instance? Sorry, guys, you know, it is technical difficulties. Actually, these 3 traits are the most common within IT professionals, and we've clearly demonstrated that very much in this room. And I know you all want the data, because that's what we're here about. This is the study that I took it from, looking at very specific personality traits compared to IT professionals and every other profession. As you can see, there are a lot of similarities, but there are also some big differences. You can see there's that extroversion we talked about earlier. That such a low score is what means introversion, of course, and tough-mindedness, which is independence. Now, I'm saying that we need to look at different ways of attracting new talent, not just the traditional diversity models, because it's a unique selling point. But it also can be an advantage. Now, outside of the IT industry, I was sometimes the only woman in the room. And what that meant is I was coming up with ideas that my male counterparts didn't. For instance, I was looking at a football marketing strategy, and I was suggesting that we should look at female football fans. Not because female football fans are traditional fans, but because I looked at a paper, Harvard Business Review actually, that said women control up to 80% of the household spending decisions and or budget. And I was the only one to make that suggestion. I'm sure some of my married counterparts already knew that, especially the men, but I was the only one brave enough to show it. And I created a new strategy that actually ended up working. And I see quite a few of us here, but how many times have you been the only person of color in the room? Once again, we've seen time and time again, marketing strategies fail because no one was there to provide a check and balance to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't post this on social media. I don't think it's a good idea. And this one, I'm sure I'll get a chuckle out of a few people. Being the only African in the room, especially when you work for things like NGOs and NPOs, meant that I was ready and willing and experienced at working with little to no resources, which is exactly the skill that they were looking for when they were hiring. Now, in my current company, I am not the only woman in the room. I'm not even the only person of color or even the only African. But what I do find myself as is the only extrovert in the room. Now, why is that important? It's because I'm not afraid to ask questions. My colleagues, my very introverted colleagues, brilliant as they are, won't voice their opinions. They won't ask questions. They won't push back. It means that maybe they understood the question, maybe they didn't, but I didn't. And when I started asking questions, then they felt more confident to ask questions themselves. Similarly, I was often the only person in the room with a customer service background. Now, why, again, is this important? I work in tech. Well, as you know, tech does not live in a bubble. So we have to speak to different stakeholders, different teams, and different departments. And I'm sure there's lots of people that can relate to this. When you're speaking to someone in tech, sometimes it feels like they're speaking a different language. You're like, hey, could you take the NPOs over to the NGOs and then make sure to carry the BVDs over to the LMNOPs? It's really hard to communicate sometimes. So it's really important being the only person that is like, hey man, I don't understand what APIs are. Could you explain it? And I'd be like, oh yeah, well, you could do this and hand it over. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I didn't understand your explanation. Could you slow it down, please? In fact, pretend like I'm 5. And that was the way that not only that I understood, but I was able to explain it to other people. And lastly, and I don't know which eagle eye of you guys spotted the pessimism on the first screen, I am sometimes the only optimist in the room. Now, I know this seems like such a silly thing to mention because what does optimism have to do with tech? Basically, it meant that sometimes I didn't know a problem couldn't be solved. And I persisted well past what my colleagues would do simply because I didn't know it couldn't be done. To give you a specific example, I was asked to convert an Excel pivot table into a Power BI pivot table. And they were like, oh, go ahead and do that. And I was like, okay, sounds like a great idea. And I was able to execute that spreadsheet and turn it into a Power BI report when none of my colleagues could, and they had so many more years of experience to me. And I know what you're thinking. Well, I don't want to reinvent the wheel. And you shouldn't. You should still use those traits that work exceptionally well for the IT industry because ultimately, that's what's going to show their success in the future. But maybe we can add some additional traits to recruit for. Maybe we can get some creatives. Maybe we can get some great communicators. Maybe we can get some extroverts. And maybe we can get some philomaths. Now, if you're like me, I love big words. That means I love to learn. And now I know what you're thinking. Where am I gonna get these hypothetical candidates out of the sky that we haven't been looking at previously? And how am I going to pay for them? Well, It's actually quite simple. Apprenticeships. A few years ago, the government here in UK noticed that there was a severe lack of skills in the digital field. And they have started funding bootcamps and apprenticeships for anyone that qualifies here within the UK. And as you can see, the government sponsors quite a bit of the levy for their salaries. And this is a way you can attract school leavers, career changers, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and get the kind of candidates that you actually need to solve the future problems within the industry. Not only that, but they will help you find an educational provider, and here are some of the more popular ones. And I know what I'm talking about because one of them is my educational provider. And who knows, next year, with an apprenticeship program at your company, one of your apprentices could be standing on this stage, giving a talk, and contributing to the future of data. Thank you. Any questions? Just hold on, there's a microphone coming.
Thank you so much. You mentioned some strategies for diversity in AI and generative AI. Do you have any other insights on broader data field for diversity?
That is an excellent question, actually. Yes, I do. So for example, you could look at design majors to become Power BI analysts because they'll be more well-versed in what looks aesthetic, and all they need is an interest in code. You could get linguistics major to look at large language learning models, for example, to make sure the syntax that is being coded, hard-coded, is being corrected, basically, for the language that exists today. You could get, I don't know, language majors, foreign language majors, to make sure that everything is being translated correctly. There is no end to who you can recruit, to who will be suitable to data. All they need is an interest in the field. I come from psychology, in case it wasn't clear, and so I came here to this industry because I love it. I'm almost at the end of my apprenticeship now, and I've enjoyed my journey every step of the way. Thank you so much for your question. Any other questions? At the back.
Hi. So I think a lot of the examples that we've seen, we know that actual damage can be caused where...
I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well.
Hello?
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah.
So there's a few examples we've seen where damage can be caused by things like self-driving cars, for example, that are more likely to bump into people in wheelchairs and things like that. Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a role for like regulation in any of this as well when it comes to incorporating diversity into AI?
Regulation in what way?
In terms of how we regulate what goes out, what products are, things that we're putting out in society to make sure that that damage isn't being done to the end users, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say this would lean more towards the strength of your existing team. So you can't just hire an apprentice and you don't have anyone to support them. I mean, if I had £1 for every time my boss was like, please don't break this, I would have been able to retire already. But at the end of the day, that's what's going to give you those checks and balances. It's your core team already in existence. So of course, you need to make sure that it's great that you won't have to spend a lot for apprentices, but you may take a hit in productivity. So you need to make sure you're compensating for that, maybe taking fewer apprentices, maybe taking them on a little bit at a time, really making sure that, yes, they're learning, but there's also safety nets to make sure that their output isn't driving into people in wheelchairs and all kinds of things. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Did you put your hand up, Rob? Yeah.
Hi, it's more of a question around your personal experiences, if that's okay.
Could you speak up, please?
It's just around... it's a question around your personal experiences, if that's okay. So I work in an environment where I've just joined a team where there has been one female, the only person of colour, the only African, and it's more around, she loves that she's now got another female, another sidekick, but she has been considering leaving because of these things, because she doesn't feel included. What kind of things can we be doing to retain our diversity, so the people that, you know, are not necessarily feeling part of a culture or part of a wider team, what can we do to foster and keep them?
So this is a little bit more subjective, because what one person considers a great culture is not what another person considers a great culture. And I would say you need to start with conversations with your employees. What drives them? What motivates them? What makes them feel comfortable? For me, for example, what I really enjoy about my current company is they're not afraid to let me push the envelope. They're not afraid to let me ask the hard questions. They're not afraid to let me speak up to anyone in the company. And I challenged the CEO, which was not smart. But those kinds of things make me feel more comfortable. And so in that way, my company created an environment where I felt like I could be my whole self. And I imagine that started a little bit with the actual recruitment process. Because what I did was I decided in my interview, I want to work for someone where I can be my whole self. I want to be able to show up in my purple suit with my weird hair, with a company that doesn't care how I look, but cares about the work that I'm actually doing. And so I am the only person of color on my specific team, my data team, but I never feel that way, because we have conversations outside of just what's relevant to work. We talk about, hey, what anime are you watching? You know, what languages are you learning? Not just computer languages, but actual human languages. One of my colleagues is learning Korean, I'm learning Japanese, and we have a little chit-chat about just our lives in general. It's about putting the human back into the process. Does that answer your question? Great.
Hi, can you hear me okay? At the back here. Hi, I started a role in April where I inherited a team where I've got no one English on my team. So it is South Asians, Chinese, a couple of people from Spain as well. And I've got quite a good balance. I've got 4 women and 6 men on my team now. I've recruited 2 men, but one thing I noticed in the recruitment process was that there was hardly any female applicants. So my team's also very introverted, and I've recently hired a data engineer, and the recruiter, my team and me, all sort of noticed that I hired someone who was like me. So there's this weird dynamic. But as I was going through the recruitment process, I was getting calls from quite a few recruiters, which a lot of people will resonate with once you post something on LinkedIn Jobs. And I had recruiters saying to me on the phone, I've got a female data engineer for you. And I said to him, I don't hire based on gender. But I just wonder whether my response would have been different if I had no women in my team. So I've got quite an interesting dynamic in terms of I haven't got an ethnically diverse team. I've got a gender diverse team. I've got a team full of introverts, and I've just hired an extrovert. What do you think of all of that?
I think you figured it out, to be honest. That's brilliant. And honestly, the same thing happened in my company. I wasn't the first woman. I am the only person of color sometimes, depending on which team I work for, but I am the only extrovert. They hired me for my communication style, which clearly has got me pretty far. So you're doing everything you can be doing, and I would say, don't rest on your laurels. Don't forget, one of the cognitive biases is, I'm okay. I don't need to change anything. Status quo is perfect. Make sure you're constantly checking back in. Make sure when you're hiring, it's kind of, oh, do I have someone like this yet? Are they going to bring something unique that we don't currently have? It could be something as small as a baker. They're like, oh, you bake, so you know how to be super patient and follow things to the letter and make sure the proportions are perfectly right. Great, sounds like you're going to be a great asset to the team. Those are the kinds of things you could continue to do when you're doing hiring in the future.
Hi. In your career, have you ever experienced being overlooked or your opinions not being listened to because of your gender or colour or background? And if so, how did you overcome that?
So, yes, I have, of course, as every woman in this room, I'm sure, has experienced that at some time or another. And I deal with it in two different ways. One is I get angry, of course. And I never approach my bosses or my company when I'm in that state. So as soon as the situation happens, I step back. And I'm like, okay, nothing good is going to come for this. Let me reflect. Then what I do is I think what I want the outcome to be. So for example, if I had the situation where I made a suggestion to my boss and he rejected it, and then in a different meeting, a male colleague made exactly the same suggestion. And I was steaming mad. And I didn't handle it well, to be honest. I immediately went to my boss and I was like, hey man, like, I made that suggestion, and now you're giving that suggestion merit when it comes from a dude. Why? And I requested a meeting, which was good, but it didn't go anywhere. And I felt undervalued in the company, and it wasn't long before I left because of that. But now, what I do when I feel overlooked is it's similar tactics, but with more introspection. So I'm like, okay, I'm mad. Let me not schedule a meeting today. Maybe I'll do it in a few days. Maybe I'll wait a week. Then I'll try with the person that it occurred with immediately. If I feel like I need to involve HR, then I will. But ultimately, it has to come down to clear communication with your employer about what you feel is unfair business practices. And if you're working for a good employer, they'll address it and they'll take immediate actions. If you're not working for a good employer, like I was in the first instance, then it's time to leave, unfortunately, because you cannot sell yourself short in an environment. You need to be where you feel worthy, where you feel honored, where you feel respected. And we all need that.